So the new 2021 Yamaha R7 was recently announced, and I think it's fair to say it generated a fair bit of interest. I'm hoping it won't be long till I actually get to ride one and find out what it's all about, but in the meantime the specs give us a pretty good idea of how it stacks up against the competition. So in this video I'll tell you about its strengths and weaknesses when set against the Aprilia RS660, Kawasaki's Ninja 650 and the Honda CBR650R. Which one is the king of the affordable middleweight sports bikes? I'll go through all of the key areas to find out. Now, at the core of the new R7 is the CP2 engine, which has powered many a successful bike, including the MT-07, XSR700, Tracer 7 and the Tenere 700. It's a 689cc parallel twin with a 270 crank for a bit of a V-twin character, sound and feel. Peak power is never going to set the world alight with 72 horsepower at 8,750 RPM, but it does make a healthy 67 Nm of peak torque, down at 6,500 revs for a bit of punchy mid-range. Now, Yamaha added an assist and slipper clutch for the first time, which makes sense for the R7's sporty nature, as it'll prevent rear wheel lockup when downshifting aggressively. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same as the other bikes, and that's actually a good thing. It's super reliable, sounds great, and has enough pluck for some entertaining road riding. Now, the Aprilia 660 is certainly the closest competitor in terms of engine layout, taking the front cylinder bank of their V4 engine, resulting in another parallel twin with a 270 crank. The key difference here though is that it can rev up well beyond the CP2, making 100 horsepower at 10,500 revs. The downside is that the identical peak torque figure of 67 Nm is also produced a couple of thousand revs higher, so you'll have to keep it singing to get the most out of it, but the rewards are certainly there with that substantial increase in top end. Speaking of which, the CBR650R is similar in capacity at 649cc, but it's an inline 4, and as such this one truly loves to rev. Now, 94 horsepower is decent, much better than the Yamaha and Kawasaki that we'll get onto, but it makes this peak up at 12,000 RPM. I found that when I borrowed the CB650R, which uses the same engine, it was a lot of fun on the right road and super smooth as well, but for day-to-day riding, especially if you're commuting a bit through town, it was a touch flat in the mid-range where a twin makes more of its grunt. But the runt of the litter in this scenario is the Ninja 650 with 67 horsepower made at 7,000 RPM and 64 Nm of peak torque at 6,700. Not only is it the least powerful of the bunch, but with a 180 crank it makes a sound that's a bit like a tractor. I should know, as I owned an ER6M when I first started this channel, and the engine is largely the same in this current generation of bikes. That said, I had the pleasure of riding the 2021 Ninja 650 for a couple of days on the track recently, and if you purely judge it on its own, there's plenty of fun to be had. It's one of those bikes that you have to work hard to get the most of, but in its own way that can be super satisfying. It's just that if you rode one of the others, then jump straight onto the Ninja with that 180 crank, the least power, and the lack of a slipper clutch, it'd almost certainly feel the least desirable. I'm gonna give this one to the Aprilia with 3 points because it makes the most power but in a fairly usable way. The R7 and CBR tie, with the Yamaha generating decent mid-range torque but not much at the top, whilst the Honda makes plenty at the top but not much in the middle, and the Kawasaki comes in last. Moving on to the chassis, and Yamaha have essentially taken the same frame as the MT-07 but added some stiffness, such as using an aluminium center brace using rigid mounts. The result is said to be more precision and responsiveness in its handling. The riding position is also geared towards sportiness, with clip-on bars, an increased seat height of 835mm, and some rear set pegs, all of which combine to accommodate more of a racing tuck. Suspension comes in the form of a 41mm upside down KYB fork with full adjustability, as well as a preload and rebound adjustable horizontal shock, enabling riders to get the most out of it on the track. Brakes are also upgraded versus the MT-07 with 4-pot radially mounted calipers on 298mm discs at the front, as well as a radial master cylinder which ought to improve feel, and that should be plenty enough stopping power to slow up a fairly slender bike at 188 kilograms curb. Now, the Aprilia stacks up pretty well with almost the exact same suspension specs, offering plenty of adjustability, and it also gets radial brakes, albeit Brembo branded calipers on slightly larger 320mm discs. It's the only bike I believe to use an aluminium frame as opposed to steel, and that could be one of the factors contributing to the lightest curb weight at 183 kilograms. In terms of ergonomics, it's slightly more relaxed and road focused, with the bars sitting slightly above the top yoke and a more accessible seat height of 815mm, but it still ought to be sporty enough for a bit of track work. Now the Honda gets decent components, a Showa separate function upside down fork and 4-pot radial Nissin brake calipers on 310mm discs, but there's only preload adjustability on the shock, and the braking setup isn't quite as premium as the other two. It gets clip-on bars, but a similarly moderate seat height to the Aprilia at 810mm. That said, it does have a fairly major shortcoming, and that's the curb weight at 208 kilograms. That's 25 more than the RS660, so basically like carrying a large sack of potatoes with you. Again, the Kawasaki is the most rudimentary of the bunch, with a non-adjustable right way up fork and preload adjustable shock, and 2-piston axial Nissin front brake calipers on 300mm wavy discs. Now it also gets a 160mm wide rear tyre, which you'd trust is the right choice for the bike, but narrower than the 180 of the others, and therefore it has a bit less of that big bike look. At 193 kilograms curb weight, it's actually not bad, still 15 kilograms lighter than the Honda, but with a seat height of 790mm I found it to be a little too relaxed for quicker riding, because the bars are pretty pulled back, and then the step up to the passenger seat prevents you from sliding your bum back and up. I'd call this one a draw for the Yamaha and Aprilia with similar specs, but the R7 looking a little more pitched up at the rear and the Aprilia having the lightest curb weight. The Honda forfeits a bit of its power advantage with all that extra weight, and the Ninja is super low and street focused. Onto the tech, and there's a clear winner here with the Aprilia packing a 6-axis inertial measurement unit that opens up lean sensitive rider aids including ABS, traction control, wheelie control, as well as adjustable engine braking and engine map, and there's also cruise control for those particularly long straights. All of these are combined into 5 riding modes, which can be administered through the TFT display, and it also gets cornering adaptive headlights and an up and down quick shifter. The rest of the field is super simple, although they each have their own individual advantages. The R7, for example, just gets ABS, no traction control or riding modes, just like its CP2 powered siblings, although there is the option of a quick shifter on the upshift for the first time. The CBR also gets an upshift accessory, and it has Honda's selectable torque control, which is their name for switchable traction control. The Kawasaki gets a pretty decent TFT display with some phone connectivity features, but otherwise it's just ABS and that's it. So the Aprilia's clearly on top here, and then I'd say the Honda for its quick shifter option and traction control. The Yamaha and Kawasaki can share last place. Now, whether you like it or not, styling is always going to be a big factor in most people's purchasing decision, but the good news here is that they all have a little bit of something about them. I guess the manufacturers want to offer a slice of their more premium, bigger bikes, and so you could say that the R7 has a touch of the R1, the RS660 shares some of its design with the RSV4, the Ninja 650 doesn't look completely unlike the ZX-10R, and you'd be forgiven for mistaking the CBR for a Fireblade at a glance. But ultimately, looks are totally subjective, so I'll leave this one to you. Let me know your pick down in the comments below. Now, the Aprilia comes out of this looking pretty strong with way more power, decent chassis specs, and loads of tech. So I guess it wouldn't surprise you to learn that it's the most expensive at £10,150. That's a couple of grand more than the Honda and 3 grand more than the Kawasaki. As for the R7, well, we don't have a final price for it yet, but Visor Down report that the Yamaha UK press team have confirmed that it will come in around the 8 grand mark. So judged purely on price alone, the Kawasaki is the most affordable, the Honda and Yamaha are on a par, and the Aprilia is going to cost you the most. And so there we have it. With my wholly unscientific scoring system, the Aprilia comes out on top, although you'll have to find the budget for it. The R7 looks pretty strong, as does the CBR, both of them having their own strengths, whilst the Kawasaki is bringing up the rear. I wouldn't write it off though if you fancy one. The price is great and it's a solid performer. Just make sure you demo some of the others before you pull the trigger. As always, I'd love to know what you think in the comments. Is this ranking about right or completely wrong? And which which bike would you take home if you had the choice? Let me know down below, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you next time.